you buy a bandsaw and you can set it up in a variety of ways. The way I prefer to do it is to take the blade, string the blade, and center the blade on the center line of the upper wheel. And by that I mean from the front of the tooth to the back of the blade, that center line between the two should line up with the center line on the upper wheel. You can pretty much actually ignore the lower wheel. The business end of this machine really is the upper wheel here. Now, bandsaws are more useful, much more useful, if they have a fence. You might be resawing, cutting joints, and so on, and you want to have perfect control over a nice straight cut. If you do not align the wheel on the center line here, if you've tracked it too close to the front, the piece of wood will automatically cut to the right. Alternately, if you track it so it's a little too close to the back, it's going to cut to the left. So by centering it here, we can count on this machine making a dead straight cut. Now the next step is a fence, and every bandsaw should have a fence. The fence should be aligned with the miter slot, right like so. And this is a Craig fence here, and they're all basically the same. There'll be a couple of bolts right in this location back here. You loosen those two bolts and bring the fence so that it's just a nice smooth surface along here. And this is important for a reason that you'll see in a second here. Now, you might think, well, if my cut is veering in one direction or the other, I can just adjust the fence to accommodate that, and you can do that. The wrinkle, though, to that approach is that this miter slot now is no longer useful. There's a number of jigs that we use repeatedly that work in this miter slot right here. So it's important that the orientation of the saw be in line with that miter slot. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to make a cut here in a scrap of wood that's been jointed on one surface here, and we're going to make a cut. Now, I have to point out that this was done when I bought the saw some years ago, and all the bandsaws in this workshop, 8 in total, we've gone through this process exactly once to get the table oriented to where it should be. Now, in order for this demonstration, I've taken the table and I've moved it out of position. And that often happens when you buy the saw. You have no idea the person that assembled it put it in the correct orientation. And another kind of thing that happens with almost a regularity, and that is people will move the bandsaw by the conveniently placed handles. And that is here and here. They want to move the bandsaw from one side of their workshop to the other or swivel it around. They'll grab these convenient handles and simply yank the saw. Well, the wrinkle to that is that underneath here, and most bandsaws either have 4 or 6 or some similar number of bolts holding the table to the trunnion. Now, those bolts go through massive, huge holes, way bigger than the bolt. And so if you can, in fact, yank the table and put it out of alignment. And you can tell if that's happened by lining your fence to the miter slot here and then making a cut like so. And if the table is been yanked out of position in that direction like so, no matter how hard you try, you will not be able to keep this piece of wood tight to the fence. Alternately, if it's been twisted in this direction, as you attempt to make your cut, resaw down the length of your piece of wood, of course, it's tight at the back here, and what you're really doing is trying to make a wedge, all right? So neither one of those is what you're actually after. What you really want is to have a space on either side of the blade as you enter the piece of wood. And to do that, we're simply going to reposition the table. Now, there's 6 bolts on the underside of this one. 2 of them are easily accessible. There's 4 on the inside that are a little more awkward. To reposition the table, you're going to undo all 6. You can shift the table in whichever direction you need to avoid rubbing on either side of the blade. And then the 2 bolts that are easily accessible, just snug those in just with enough tightness, and at that point, try it again. And it could very well be right bang on the money, perhaps it's not. Then you take a look at which side it's rubbing, and then move the table to avoid that rubbing that's occurring. Okay, so we've shifted the table out of whack here. I'm going to turn the saw on. Now, you can see that as I advance my piece of wood into the blade, it's pulling away from the fence here because it's rubbing on this side of the blade right here. Now, to fix that, I'm going to undo those 2 bolts and shift it again. And if it's still pulling away from the fence, then I'm going to shift it a little bit further. Remember, there's that large hole that bolt can move around in quite easily. So at that point, we've got to make one more adjustment. We've adjusted the table now, just incrementally moved it so the blade is no longer rubbing on that back corner. So I'm going to try it and see what happens. I'm going to raise the guard here so it's a little easier to see what's going on. And you can see we've got a little bit of space here, and we've got a little bit of space here. So now that we're certain that we've got space on either side, we really want to drop our guide and our guard down into place. And then we certainly, remember we only were snugging up 2 bolts on the underside here. But now that we're getting exactly what we're after, you've got to remember to go back in and snug the rest of the bolts here. We've got 2 tight at this point. We need the other 4 tight on this saw for a total of 6. So at that point, as long as you never grab the table to move the bandsaw, you only have to do this once in your lifetime. The bandsaw that we use most frequently in the other room, I did this in 1974, and that bandsaw is still tracking exactly parallel to the miter slot.